There are real movies and then there are movies that blow you away. You think that at this point in our cinematic life, there is nothing left to surprise us, that we have seen it all, that it's all been invented, but you'd be sadly mistaken. Why should we be? Let's begin an adventure through the craziest films we've ever seen. Prepare to enter the mind of Eraserhead and lose all sense of reality. Eraserhead is a confusing mix of bizarre images and disturbing characters. If you're looking for a logical narrative, forget it. Eraserhead is the first feature film in the horror genre and the first film by American director David Lynch. The film tells the story of Henry Spencer, a nervous, anxious young man who accepts a sudden fatherhood that completely changes his routine life. Henry becomes the father of a monstrous creature. Yes, that's off to a great start. Imagine this before you watch the film. That is, if you want to watch it later. A man, Henry Spencer, appears floating in space, with some kind of large sperm coming out of his mouth. As he floats, a strange planet appears behind him, where a strange-looking, half-consumed man pulls several levers and opens several holes. It all takes place in the mind of Henry Spencer, a man with a depressive and frightened state who, since childhood, has suffered from strange nightmares, from which he tries to free himself through imagination. In this film, everything is a strange and difficult story to follow, as what happens in the film resembles more a very heavy nightmare than the conventional stories we're used to in cinema. The movie is in black and white. The camera follows a few events in the life of this particular character, an almost always nervous and paranoid man who, without knowing when, how or why, has a monstrous unwanted child with his former girlfriend. That's how crazy or strange this film is. The world in which Spencer lives, or the world that the film proposes, gives the impression of being set in post-industrial, neurotic society of scarcity and cold, and forms the scenario for a whole series of dreamlike events that unfold before the bemused eyes of the viewer, who hesitate both to stay and watch the film and to get up from the couch without knowing what is going on in the repulsive events it narrates. For example, in one of the film scenes, when Spencer finally decides to put an end to the mystery of his terrifying son, everything turns into a moment of maximum horror. The viewer has the impression that the electric light is falling, and as it does, the monstrous baby's head grows enormously and creeps into the character's room, even though the latter doesn't appear in many shots of the scene. Another key scene in the film, in which the protagonist sits down to dinner with his ex-girlfriend's family, and the mother of his child, if you can call it that, looks like a total nightmare. It's a really difficult moment to digest and far too creepy, let's be honest, but after all, like the general mood of this film, this scene puts much smaller chickens on the table, which will obviously be the protein of the meal. But when the guests lend themselves to cutting up of the prey, the bride's mother either has pain directly linked to the cutting up of the chickens, or a series of orgasms. This is exactly the kind of scene you're delighted to come across with your parents when watching a film, not embarrassing at all. It's all that peculiar and crazy about the film's very meaning, because it's abstract and therefore vague. The job of analysis is to extract the ambiguous meanings underlying the work and interpret them. It's like reconstructing a poem. Reconstructing the symbols doesn't give the interpretation, it simply brings out the metaphor, whose meaning is by nature unstable and shifting. Finally, with Eraserhead, Lynch proposes in an introspective and expressionistic way a disturbing path through some of man's most recondite and common obsessions, as well as through his own inner, unconscious but utterly bizarre world. Shot in 1988 and officially released on July 1, 1989, I'd like to pay a well-deserved artistic tribute to this cult film, which has become an essential reference in Japanese cyberpunk cinema. Shot in black and white by virtuoso cinematographer Shinya Tsukamoto. Tsueu I, the Iron Man, is visually distinguished by the artistic brilliance of its photography, to the point of excelling in conceptual innovation. The plot that gives Tsueu I, the Iron Man, its artistic personality is complex, and hinges on China Tsukamoto's brilliant idea of fusing flesh and metal, which in this story is embodied by the fetishist played by the director himself, a man obsessed with the idea of mutating flesh and metal in his own body to become a hybrid. The film's basic idea alone doesn't bode well. Thus, in the film's opening sequences, we see him introducing pieces of metal into his body, with somewhat unpleasant results for the most sensitive viewers. Let's be honest, I'm one of them. According to the fetish man's essential perspective, when this mutation has been achieved, living in a society physically and technologically dominated by metal, the expansion of his hybrid alter ego will not be long in coming, initiating a gradual evolution and growth that will become colossal and gigantic until it devours everything in its path, only to relentlessly reduce it to rust dust. With a cinematic made in Japan, apocalyptic cut ending masterfully defined in the last 15 minutes of this film. So much for the fact that before its tortuous throughout, the vertebration of this incredible story into high-impact audiovisual sequences will remain indelibly etched in your mind after viewing them. You'll be impressed, for example, by the disturbing atmosphere interspersed with images of athletes and metal parts, when the fetish man performs his rituals on his body with metal, when he inserts a threaded steel rod into his thigh after making a large incision, when you hear the chilling sound of the steel rod being threaded as it passes between his teeth, or by the horror, agony and madness you'd breathe in the scene with a woman with glasses. A woman in glasses who will present her most sinister image in the somewhat gory sequence that takes place in the garage, and with that spectacular background music that will heighten the intensity and drama felt by the viewer. You'll be shocked to see the visual crudity presented with the progressive mutation from which the protagonist of this story suffers, or with the hellish images of his new self directly linked to the mental disillusion of the fetishist man. 90 years ago, in 1932, Freaks was released, one of the most controversial, daring and moving films in the history of cinema. Can't you tell from the various films I've mentioned above? Obviously, I'll save the best or rather the worst for last. Hold on tight, it's going to go a long way. In fact, the outcry of screaming, fainting and abortions led to the film's withdrawal a few days later, and it was even said that the negatives had been thrown into San Francisco Bay, so that no one would see such an aberrant spectacle again. This was the first horror movie to feature real monsters, the protagonists being deformed creatures, although Browning filmed the monsters with great tenderness. The society of 1932 was not ready for such a provocative film, which forced man to face up the horrors around him. For this reason, it was considered cursed, so much so that it was kept in a drawer for 25 years. In Spain, for example, it was screened for the first time in the 70s as a Stage's Fantastic Film Week. The film is set in a traveling circus. The characters are somewhere between admiration, pity and horror. Shields, Cuckoo and the Pinheads, cute mentally retarded people suffering from microcephaly, a disease that gives the impression that their skulls have been shrunken by gibarros. You know, that tribe that makes heads shrink. As you have probably seen the scene in Pirates of the Caribbean, with Jack Sparrow and his back-bearded father, showing him his mother's head. Their strange appearance inspires more tenderness than fright. The armless woman who compensates for a lack of arms with astonishing dexterity on her feet. The Siamese sisters, united by their trunks. Josephine Joseph, half man, half woman, perhaps a hermaphrodite, the bearded woman or the fascinating Prince Radiant. The living torso, a man without arms or legs, who moves like a worm with dexterity. The scene where he lights a cigarette unaided is a thing of strange beauty. Faced with the spectacle of strangeness, feelings are contradictory. We can't take our eyes off the screen, fascinated by what we're seeing, even if our 21st century mentality tells us that what we're contemplating is brutally cruel and sensational. In short, it is a circus in which several people with severe physical deformities earn their living as fairground attractions. A voluptuous trapeze artist and a strong-willed lover attempt to take advantage of a dwarf and seize his fortune. Once the beauty's intentions are revealed and the dwarf's humiliating deception in love is uncovered, the vengeance of all his handicapped comrades leads to a terrible, dramatic end for the villainous duo. What about you? Do you know of any films as creepy as today's? Or films that we could literally no longer produce today without receiving the wrath of hundreds of associations?